I'd returned from work to meet my family seated in the living room, alongside Ace, who was beside Betty. I was quite taken aback when my dad asked me to sit on the sofa, which wasn't taken. I obeyed, my heart racing. "Well, Greg, your sister and her boyfriend complained to me about being uncomfortable in the house with you around them." "Huh? Betty, do I bother you? I haven't even spoken to you both since you arrived."
Well, with you here, the house feels crowded.
Crowded? Yes, it's crowded. You have only 3 days to leave this house, Greg. That's all. Moreover, you don't contribute anything in this house except the peanuts you give us as rent, whereas Ace is rich and helps take care of us. I couldn't close my mouth. I stared at them, feeling a mixture of hurt, betrayal, and sadness. They'd just treated me like a piece of dirt, like a stranger. Quietly, I stood up and walked out of the living room. In my room, I called a close friend I'd met at the restaurant. I was ashamed, but I had no choice. I explained things to him and asked if he could accommodate me until I could get my apartment. Fortunately, he agreed. That night, I packed my things and walked out of the house. My name's Gregory, but everyone calls me Greg. I mean, it's shorter and better. One night, I had a fight with my parents. Not a fight, literally, and not words exchanged either. It was basically just them speaking down on me, and of course, me taking it. I'd just finished college. In fact, my graduation was only the week before. I was in the living room, eating from the box of pizza my mom ordered, when she walked in with my dad. Together, they'd gone out for a friend's daughter's marriage. I welcomed them, but got no reply. Instead, they lashed out on me. "The girl who got married today is only 3 years older than you. She's the same age as her husband, and he already has a car and a house of his own."
I heard the lovely man is also planning to get her mother a house.
That night, they spoke a lot, and I ended up going to the bed, hungry and angry. They only saw me as a loser and will always look down on me. I couldn't sleep, not with my parents' words continuously ringing in my head. I had to speed up my search for a job. I needed to save up quickly and leave their house, since it was clearly what they wanted. However, I was wrong about that. I did get a job, 1 week later, at a huge restaurant. The pay was great. I was sure I would move out to a great apartment in the next 6 months. I also hoped my parents would stop harassing me when I finally told them about the job. They were on a 2-week vacation in the neighboring town, so I couldn't tell them about my job until they returned. When I finally did, the reply I got was totally unexpected and insanely shocking. "Well, since you have a job now, living here won't be free anymore." I could barely even remember to breathe. I looked at him intently, hoping he was only joking, but their expressions showed that they were dead-ass serious. "No, this is insane. How can you ask your child to pay rent for living in your house?" "No, this is ridiculous. The only ridiculous thing here is you barking over something that wouldn't have happened if you were smart enough to get an office job, which would have paid you better."
The amount you'll be paying as rent is $500 monthly. If you don't agree with it, then you can simply get out of this house.
I didn't have anywhere to go, so I couldn't leave. My pay was $1,500 monthly. They're asking to be given a quarter of it. I also had to feed myself and also fund my transportation. Without a choice, I agreed. They made me sign an agreement to add $10 after 1 day of delay. I continued working at the restaurant. The first month ended, and I received my pay. I paid rent to my parents and divided the rest. By the time I'd assigned a duty to each part, I barely had anything to save. My heart sank. How was I going to get myself an apartment? I didn't want to continue paying such a ridiculous amount to my parents. I did save up a little money, and I continued to do so every month. By the 4th month, I'd gathered a quarter of what I imagined to gather in 2 months. It didn't matter though. I was making progress. I knew that in another 4 months, I'd have achieved my goal. My parents had stopped letting me eat their food, even on days when I was free. If my mom cooked, she would only prepare the quantity she and my dad could finish. That meant more money for me to spend. Luckily, the restaurant allowed me to eat there, so I only had to spend on food on my off days and some nights when I returned from work. Soon, we progressed to barely saying anything to each other. I mean, I was never able to have long conversations with them, but even the short ones had gotten shorter. It hurt me that they only remembered my existence only when it was time to pay rent, but I didn't dwell on it. I thought things were going smoothly until my sister Betty showed up with her rugged boyfriend, Ace. They'd both been dating for 2 years. It was surprising when my parents let her go live with him when she was only 18. I'd last seen her on the day of her 19th birthday. Her boyfriend had thrown a lavish party for her. At the time when she left to live with him, he was quite a rich boy. I wondered what job he did, but I couldn't ask. My parents said he was better than I could ever be, so I simply kept my question to myself. My sister and her boyfriend had moved in with us. No one told me anything. Well, until the next day. I'd returned from work to meet my family seated in the living room, alongside Ace, who was beside Betty. I was quite taken aback when my dad asked me to sit on the sofa, which wasn't taken. I obeyed, my heart racing. "Well, Greg, your sister and her boyfriend complained to me about being uncomfortable in the house with you around them." "Huh? Betty, do I bother you? I haven't even spoken to you both since you arrived."
Well, with you here, the house feels crowded.
Crowded? Yes, it's crowded. You have only 3 days to leave this house, Greg. That's all. Moreover, you don't contribute anything in this house except the peanuts you give us as rent, whereas Ace is rich and helps take care of us. I couldn't close my mouth. I stared at them, feeling a mixture of hurt, betrayal, and sadness. They just treated me like a piece of dirt, like a stranger. Quietly, I stood up and walked out of the living room. In my room, I called a close friend I'd met at the restaurant. I was ashamed, but I had no choice. I explained things to him and asked if he could accommodate me until I could get my apartment. Fortunately, he agreed. That night, I packed my things and walked out of the house. My family ignored me as I walked away, and that was when I felt hot tears rolling down my cheeks. I began living with my friend. Together, we went to work and returned home. I wanted to pay the rent with him, but he refused. According to him, he knew I was struggling and couldn't add to it. I thanked him so much. When that month ended, I suddenly got a call from my parents.
When are you sending your rent in? It's already 1 day late, so you need to include the $10.
I burst into laughter. Ha ha ha. Rent? Have you forgotten you all sent me out? I won't be paying a dime to you anymore. She flared up, telling me I needed to continue paying because my sister was living with them. I refused to pay, telling her to ask Ace to pay, since he was rich enough.
Ace lost all his money to an investment. He was going to better our lives if it had worked out. You need to help them, Greg. They can't afford to pay for it.
I thought about it deeply. I didn't want to pay for it. My mind went back to a job vacancy someone told me about 3 days ago. I'm not sorry about it, but I can't pay their rent. Instead, I can help them get jobs. I'll contact someone and refer them to him. That's the only thing I can do. Goodbye. The vacancy I had in mind had already been taken, but 2 came out from my workplace. A waiter and a waitress were needed. I told Betty and Ace about it, and they got the jobs. Fast forward to 2 months later, my family held a party to celebrate my grandmother's birthday. Well, surprisingly, they invited me. I took an excuse from work and attended. However, when everyone gathered at the big table, my parents began talking down on me.
So what does Greg do now?
Before I could answer, my mom did.
Well, he works at a shitty restaurant as a cleaner. He's my son, but he's really lazy. We had to force him to get this job.
Honestly, I've never heard of a more stupid son. He doesn't even send us money. If we didn't have Betty, we would have died of hunger.
Oh, Dad. I do the little I can, since my elder brother has refused to take responsibility as the elder.
I felt so embarrassed, hearing them sit there and talk so descending about me. It was even worse when my cousins chimed in and began talking bad about me for being lazy and not taking care of my parents. Shut the hell up, all of you. How dare you? I work as a chef in one of the most popular restaurants in this city. I earn more money than nearly all of you here. I could see the shock on their faces. I turned to my parents. I bet you've both gone mad. Tell them how you both took $500 from me as rent for living in your house. Tell them how I got jobs for Betty and this asshole as waiters in my workplace. Tell everyone. Y'all sit here and shit-talk me like I'm nobody. I'm better than you all hypocrites. You can enjoy the rest of this stupid celebration. Goodbye. I stormed out of the room and headed straight to my friend's house. Betty and Ace didn't come to work the next day. I immediately put up a vacancy post, and we got their replacements barely 2 hours later. After 2 days, they finally showed up. They confronted me about my actions, and I asked them to get out before I did something crazy. However, before I could speak more, Betty suddenly slapped me. "Are you crazy?" A punch landed on my face from Ace, sending me to the floor. He pounced on me and began punching me. The restaurant owner and a few customers intervened, pulling him off and sending them out. I apologized to the owner and pleaded with him for a day off. He immediately agreed and also advised me to report them to the police. I did. With the bruises I sustained still fresh, I headed to the police station, and Betty and her boyfriend got arrested. My parents called to beg me to release them, but I refused and charged them to court. They were both found guilty of assault. Even more, it was discovered that Ace was a fraud and not the investor he claimed to be. That added to his jail term. While Betty got 2 years, he got 10, both with hard labor. My parents rained vile words on me for sending their daughter to jail, but I didn't care. It was needed. My friend was generous enough to help me with some money, and I was able to get myself a comfortable apartment. After a month, my parents suddenly called me.
Greg, dear, can you move back in? We're badly in need of money, and your rent will go a long way in helping us. You know Ace and your sister had been the ones supporting us, and now they are in jail, so we need money, please.
I couldn't believe my ears. They'd lost every sense of shame in them. Wow. It's sad how you're both still so shameless even until the end. I'll say this only once. I'm never coming back to that house, or even your lives. I do not want to have anything to do with you anymore. Consider yourselves parents of only a child who's in jail. If you ever try to contact me, I'll go as far as getting a restraining order on you both. Goodbye. I ended the call and even blocked their lines. They didn't know where I lived, so I was sure they wouldn't find me. I was going to focus on my life and make it better. A few months later, one evening while watching the news, I saw a picture of my father. Apparently, my parents had been so broke that they borrowed money from a loan shark and were unable to pay it back. This led to the gang kidnapping and torturing my dad. According to the news, the suspects were never caught. My mom had no choice but to sell their house to pay the debt to avoid any more kidnappings, leaving them very broke. When my dad was released, they ended up renting a tiny room with 2 other people who constantly drink and play loud music. I guess they are so depressed. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment down below saying I subscribed, and we will try our best to reply to your comment.
Grandpa, Grandma, I'm really hungry. May I please have something to eat?
Feed you? Aren't you old enough to get yourself a job and pay for your own food instead of mooching off of us?
No, I'm only 14.
Old enough to do work. Well, you can do some cleaning and cooking around here, and we will give you food in exchange.
I couldn't help but notice that what they were essentially offering me was becoming their slave. They even gave me a maid's uniform. Sadly, working around the house didn't get me any better lodgings and barely that much more food, but it did cause them to treat me even worse. As I was washing the kitchen floors, my grandmother came into the room.
You are doing such a terrible job. Look at this floor. You've been scrubbing it for 10 minutes now, and it's still as filthy as you are. I would have figured that someone like you would know how to clean at least a little bit.
What do you mean? The floor is almost spotless. Hi, my name is Sophia, and I have a very difficult relationship with my family. Although not all of them are terrible people, there are definitely those that have made my life a nightmare, but also more than a few that really made me feel loved and wanted. It's a bit difficult to explain, but let me start by saying that my parents were amazing people. However, it was their marriage that caused the rift with my grandparents, though. When I was young, I never realized why my grandparents were so cold towards my father and I, but later, when I grew up, I found out that my grandparents hated me and my father and were always upset that my parents had gotten married against their wishes. You see, my father is black and my mother was white. They had 2 children, myself and my younger brother Mitch, who looked very different. I looked exactly like my father with dark black skin, while my younger brother looked like he had a slight tan. As such, my grandparents loved him so much, but because of their hatred of me and my father, they always kept their distance. I do remember the last time that they visited, though. They had bought my little brother a new bike and came over to give it to him.
Here you go. Mitch, a brand new bike. Thanks, guys. It's amazing. I love it. Great. That's really nice of you. But what is the special occasion? What do you mean? Can't we get our favorite grandchild a present? Of course, it's good of you to bring him a gift, but you never get any gifts for Sophia. And why would we? She's filthy just like you. I can't understand why my daughter would marry an animal like you, but at least we got one grandchild worthy of our family name out of it.
Soon after that, though, my parents stopped talking and cut all ties with my grandparents. I later found out that it was because my parents were just sick and tired of the obvious favoritism that my brother was getting, and all because, oh, our skin color. Time passed, though, and I began to think about them less and less. Until one day my parents were closing their business when someone tried to mug them. During the robbery, the thief turned violent and shot and killed my parents. A police officer showed up at our house and told my brother and I the bad news. The month after their deaths passed by in a blur. Neither my brother or I knew what was going to happen to us. After all, I was 14 and Mitch was 10. It wasn't like we could live on our own. The one person that wanted to take us in was our father's brother Henry. But unfortunately, he lived in a small house and didn't have room for us, so our future was unknown. That is, until our grandparents stepped forward and offered to take us in. I was incredibly worried, and when we arrived at their house, my fears were validated. For starters, my room was barely more than a large closet, while Mitch's room was massive. 5 people could have slept in king-sized beds in his room. When it came to having meals, they never told me when they were making anything. Occasionally, I would find them eating and help myself to some food, but otherwise, I would go hungry. Grandpa, Grandma, I'm really hungry. May I please have something to eat?
Feed you? Aren't you old enough to get yourself a job and pay for your own food instead of mooching off of us?
No, I'm only 14.
Old enough to do work. Well, you can do some cleaning and cooking around here, and we will give you food in exchange.
I couldn't help but notice that what they were essentially offering me was becoming their slave. They even gave me a maid's uniform. Sadly, working around the house didn't get me any better lodgings and barely that much more food, but it did cause them to treat me even worse. As I was washing the kitchen floors, my grandmother came into the room.
You are doing such a terrible job. Look at this floor. You've been scrubbing it for 10 minutes now, and it's still as filthy as you are. I would have figured that someone like you would know how to clean at least a little bit.
What do you mean? The floor is almost spotless. She was, of course, not even looking at the floor, and she suddenly walked up behind me and shoved her foot hard into my back and caused me to collapse onto the bucket I was using, and causing it to spill out onto the floor. All my hard work was undone, and I was incredibly sore. Deep down, I knew that I couldn't say or doing anything and just cleaned up the mess that she had made. As she was walking away, I heard her mutter some racist phrases, but I doubt you would want me to repeat them. The next day, my grandfather barged into my room at 4 a.m. and threw a bucket of boiling hot water on me and then yelled at me.
You lazy piece of crap. We give you food and a bed to sleep on, and you can't clean anything right. Your grandmother told me how you were disrespectful to her yesterday. I am leaving to go and visit friends shortly. And when I get back later this afternoon, you'd better have the entire house clean and spotless, or else you regret being here.
Just as before, I didn't dare say anything. But the moment he left, I cried until my eyes were dry and then got busy doing as I was told. Later, before my grandparents came home, though, I called my Uncle Henry and begged him to come and get me.
I am so sorry, Sophia. But your grandparents legally are your guardians. I can't come there and take you, or else they'll have me arrested.
But they are treating me like a slave and abusing me.
I know, sweetheart. Don't worry, though. I'll give you money from time to time to keep you fed and such. Just keep calling me and let me know that you are all right. It's going to be okay.
After that, my uncle would sneak me food and money to help me out. The next few years were terrible for me, and I barely felt like a member of the family. Mitch, however, was treated like a god and was given literally everything he ever asked for. It was absolutely enraging, but I bided my time. Finally, my 18th birthday came and passed, and of course, no one other than my Uncle Henry acknowledged it. However, my grandparents did tell Mitch some good news.
Mitch, in 4 years, you will be 18, and we will of course cover your entire school career. How does that sound? I'm assuming that you won't be doing the same for that idiot Sophia, right? Who? Oh, you mean that abomination? No, of course not. She's just lucky we haven't kicked her out on the street.
I chose to just smile because I knew that in a few days that I would be leaving and that I would never again have to deal with them again. And just as my uncle and I had planned. I did just that. I left in the middle of the night while everyone was asleep, and I never looked back. A few months later, my uncle helped me apply to get a better education so that I could later apply for law school, and while it was difficult, I worked hard and was accepted and eventually graduated and was hired by the government as a prosecutor. I mostly worked on cases where people owed money to the government, and it was my job to decide how severe the punishment would be. Then I would present it to a judge, and they would make a determination on my opinions if the people would be fined or if it was bad enough, if they would be sent to prison. I found that I was very good at this job, and I would work with those people that had merely fallen a bit behind on payments and get them back on track. While those people that were really breaking the law, I saw fit to get them the punishments they deserved. So when I saw my grandparents' names on a file in the system, I was filled with excitement. Of course, it would be a conflict of interest if I worked on their case as I was family, despite the fact that they didn't think of me as such. Looking into their file, I saw that they hadn't paid their taxes in over a decade and owed tens of thousands of dollars. Seeing this, I knew that there was a chance that my coworker would have the choice to fine them heavily or propose prison time. And so I went to talk to them, and after I told them who they were to me and what they had done to me, he asked how I wanted them to be punished, and I told him that I wanted him to justify giving them the absolute highest punishment possible, to which he laughed and promised that he would. A few weeks later, I got a phone call from them.
Sophia, listen, we heard that you work for the government now. Listen, we are in a bit of a problem, and we need you to help us.
Oh, you have got to be kidding me. You seriously have the nerve to ask me for help?
Of course I do. We fed you, clothed you, and gave you a bed. You owe us a great deal. Plus, you fled from our home and made our neighbors look poorly at us. You ruined our reputation, and it has taken years to repair it.
Oh, just shove that nonsense up your ass. You also treated me like a slave and abused me for no better reason than because you are racist idiots. Just so you know, I could have helped you, and I chose to, instead, ensure that you will suffer the worst punishment possible. If I were you, I would get used to the idea that you will be spending the rest of your miserable lives in prison, and even if you manage to live long enough to get out of prison, you'll be penniless if you do. And with that, I hung up the phone and blocked their number. I never actually did speak with them ever again, but I did keep track of them. Sure enough, they did end up going to prison, and prison was not kind to them. They spent over 10 years behind bars, and my grandfather passed away from a stroke while in prison. My grandmother did manage to live long enough, but once she was released, she was broken as a person and ended up living on the street. I was confused why my brother hadn't taken her in, but it turned out that he too was living on the street. He had become too dependent on our grandparents, and when they went to prison, he squandered what remained of their money after the government had taken what was owed to them. I have seen him and my grandmother a few times begging, but all I ever do is laugh at them. As far as I'm concerned, they got exactly what they deserve. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.
During exam season, my father came to give me an ultimatum. This can't go on like this. We're losing a lot of money because of you. Do you want to end up like your Uncle Albert, who studied until he lost his mind and now lives in a filthy apartment on the outskirts? I didn't say I wanted to stop working with you. I can do both at the same time. No, clearly you can't, and you'll have to choose. Either continue working with us where you belong and quit school, or continue in that stupid pursuit of knowledge and say goodbye to this family forever. Hi, my name is Jem. My family was always, in monetary terms, what could be considered humble people. We didn't possess much, but what little we had was enough to lead a decent existence without having to endure deprivation. My parents had a small fast food business. They had an old van that they used to drive around the city daily, looking for potential customers. Since they didn't have their own establishment to sell their hamburgers, the back of that vehicle served as a kitchen, where my mother used to prepare the food that would later be sold. With my father at the wheel, in charge of public relations, as he liked to call them, and my mother at the stove, one could say that the business was completely family-run. Not only did they strive to make it succeed, but from a very young age, they insisted that my brother George and I participate in the business. Come on, Jem, put in a bit more effort or you won't amount to anything. I didn't raise a lazy person, and it seems like you're about to fall asleep in front of the frying pan. If you burn yourself, I'm not going to treat you. Sorry. I have an exam today, so I stayed up studying late last night.
And why didn't you study earlier? What a lack of discipline. That's why you're not performing well in school or at work.
Yesterday, I didn't have time until after dinner. Don't you remember I told you? As soon as I got back from school, you sent me to run some errands. And then when I came back, I had to take care of sales in the van. It was your turn. And no, I don't want to hear another word, or you'll go without pay this month. The pay I received was actually miserable, barely $50 a month, which I couldn't even spend on treats, but had to reserve for buying school supplies. My parents didn't believe in the current education system, arguing that beyond learning to read and count, it wasn't good for much else. That's why they never contributed a cent to it. If I needed something for school, I had to buy it with my own money. Then, regarding the work my parents forced us to do, it changed over the years. At the beginning, when we were too young to be trusted with preparing the hamburgers, we exclusively distributed flyers at traffic lights, encouraging people to visit our business. Later, as we grew up, we were assigned tasks such as cleaning, purchasing required ingredients, customer service, and even cooking. It got to the point where, excluding the hours we spent at school, we dedicated the rest of the day to the business. George seemed satisfied. I wasn't. I was convinced that if it weren't for the government making it mandatory for us to go to school, my father would have us working for him all day long. Wouldn't you like to leave this? Why? It's guaranteed work, and anyway, what do you need what they teach you in school for? Our parents would never let you go to college anyway. No, but at least finishing high school would be nice. Be careful with what you're doing. Our parents are already suspicious because you're spending too much time buried in books and not paying enough attention to work as you should. I wanted to protest, but I realized George was right. I didn't dislike the family business, although I'd be lying if I said I wanted to spend my whole life in it. I wasn't going to give up my studies, no matter how consuming they were. Unfortunately, George wasn't far off with his warnings, and a couple of weeks later, during exam season, my father came to give me an ultimatum. This can't go on like this. We're losing a lot of money because of you. Do you want to end up like your Uncle Albert, who studied until he lost his mind and now lives in a filthy apartment on the outskirts? I didn't say I wanted to stop working with you. I can do both at the same time. No, clearly you can't, and you'll have to choose. Either continue working with us where you belong and quit school, or continue in that stupid pursuit of knowledge and say goodbye to this family forever. I thought he was joking, that he wouldn't actually kick me out for continuing to go to school, but my father was dead serious, and my mother supported him. At first, I decided to give in, pretend I agreed with them, and put more effort into work without completely abandoning my studies. But as soon as I finished compulsory schooling, it became clear that my parents didn't buy my little act. Repeating the threats my father once said to me, they didn't wait to hear my opinion before throwing me out onto the streets with the few possessions I had. I was 14 at the time and didn't know where to go. The only relative who lived nearby and whom I knew was Uncle Albert, about whom my parents always made disparaging remarks and told unsavory stories. Frankly, I was a bit scared of him because of what I'd heard, but what other option did I have than to show up at his door and hope for the best? They've kicked you out? They can't do that. They say I'm worthless if I can't work, that they would be losing money. And in a way, I think they're right. Since George and I joined the business, they've been able to relax more, taking more breaks. This is absolutely deplorable. Come, you can stay at my house, no problem. It turned out Uncle Albert wasn't the crazy person I was led to believe. On the contrary, he was incredibly kind and grounded. He sympathized with me from the get-go when I told him my story, arguing that what my parents had been doing to me was abuse, and that I should never have been given the option to leave school at such a young age. In the end, not only did my uncle permanently take me into his home, but he also allowed me to continue attending high school without any conditions attached. Uncle Albert wasn't rich, but he wasn't as poor as my parents claimed either. He lived in a modest apartment, yes, but it was cleaner and tidier than my own home. Here, I could have a room to myself instead of sharing one with George, and far from urging me to find something more productive to do with my time. Uncle Albert always encouraged me to study and aim high. After all, he had been a university professor before retiring, so he was an academic and knew perfectly well what he was saying when he encouraged me. Years later.
Hey, Jem, did you know there are some people in a van bad-mouthing you to whoever listens? I think it's your parents.
That can't be. I haven't been with them for years. What are they doing?
They're saying they have an ungrateful son. That sheer luck has kept you from ending up dead in a ditch, but your time will come. They even insinuated that you're involved in drugs or some other shady business.
I haven't even contacted them in years. I hadn't contacted them, but they knew I was with Uncle Albert because he called them the first night I was at his house, 5 years ago, to let them know. A mere courtesy, just so they wouldn't worry about me anymore, if they ever had. Now that I found out they had been bad-mouthing me behind my back, and probably still were, it made my blood boil. I wanted to pay them back somehow, and I found a way to carry out my little revenge, which would escalate in a way I never imagined. Could you lend me the graffiti spray cans that you and your friends usually use for your paintings? I'll pay you for it. Just name a price. Are you sure? If the police catch you, we didn't give you anything. Don't worry, they won't catch me. And they didn't catch me. Having traveled so much around the city in those years when I worked as a slave for my parents, I knew the streets well and knew their blind spots, where there were no security cameras to betray me. One night, while everyone was asleep, I made a graffiti on my parents' van, calling them thieves and accusing them of selling harmful products for health. Truth be told, I didn't know to what extent the fast food they sold was fit for human consumption. Originally, I was only going to write thieves in big letters on the side of the van, but once I started doing it, I thought, what if? Because such a random insult would only provoke laughter from the neighbors. If I accused them of something, besides humiliating them, it would also leave the neighbors wondering, so I filed a complaint about the business accusing them of poor hygiene under a fake name. So that's what I did, expanding my revenge. And I must say it worked perfectly. As I did the graffiti on the side where my relatives didn't get into the van, and it was still very dark when they started using it the next day, they never realized that someone had vandalized it until many hours later, having already driven through half the city, to the astonishment of the neighbors, when the police stopped them. Jem, did you know your parents are in custody? How? It's only temporary, while they investigate. But it seems someone accused them of selling food in poor condition, and the authorities started investigating. Your parents didn't have permission to have that business. They never got it. The place where they cook doesn't meet health standards, and it's very likely that they'll get a fine of thousands of dollars. Apart from having to close the fast food business, of course. I couldn't believe it. How had my plan worked out so well? Not only did my parents end up ruined, having to sell the van and much of their possessions to pay that fine imposed by the government, but it turned out that Uncle Albert had more money than they thought, and since I lived with him for many years, he decided to leave me his entire inheritance when he passed away, and I was rich. I managed to send George money whenever he needs it, but nothing for my parents. In the end, my parents ended up on the streets, without a single dollar from that supposed family business that was supposed to lift us out of poverty. And I, for my part, could continue studying, enroll in a university, and eventually get a good job, thanks to the unconditional support I received from my uncle. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. In an attempt to silence me. Why can't you be as calm and polite as Nikki? All you know how to do is complain.
If you're so unhappy in this family, leave. Anyway, you don't contribute much to the household. You're more of a hindrance.
The problem began with threats to refuse to pay for my university expenses and ended with my parents kicking me out of the house as soon as I turned 18. It was a terrible time for me. With nowhere to go and not enough money to sustain myself, I had to rely on all my ingenuity to avoid ending up on the streets. I don't think I come from a dysfunctional family, or at least I didn't think so when I was little. My family always treated me well, providing me with all the love and care necessary despite never being in the best economic situation. And indeed, that's how it continued during the first years of my life, in a practically idyllic harmony where, although I was never the favored one at home, they never denied me basic attention. Everything began to change, without me even realizing it, when my brother Nicky was born. Now that you're going to become a big brother, you'll have to take on more responsibilities and help us always ensure his well-being. Understood? My father stated this with pride, thus passing on his own excitement about having a new member in the family to me. And although at first I didn't understand why everyone was so excited, Soon the reason why all the adults around me were so thrilled became clear. This is something I learned many years later, well into adolescence, but my own birth was not planned. Rather, it was the result of a careless night of partying and drunkenness. There was nothing wrong with it. Or, better said, I didn't think there was anything wrong with it at that time. But many things that I considered as unchangeable truths in my early youth would soon be shaken. Nicky turned out to be the perfect child in my parents' eyes, not only because of his beauty, but also because of his friendly character and all the successes he seemed destined to achieve from a very young age. Not only my parents, but everyone who knew him didn't hesitate to shower him with compliments, praising him for his good looks and his good behavior. Soon, the comparisons began.
Caleb, why can't you be a bit more like your brother? Look how sociable he is. They've barely met the neighbor's son and they're already playing as if they've been friends for a lifetime.
But Mom, he's 3 years old. Anyone who approaches you at 3 years old, you consider them your friend. Not only should you be more sociable, but also improve your grades. Who goes to 3rd grade and doesn't have an A in all subjects? Surely Nicky could do better. He can already read and do sums. He's way ahead of his peers. He actually only knows a few letters and can count to 10.
Jealousy is a very bad thing, son. It corrodes the soul.
Perhaps my mother was right, and feeling jealous was a waste of time. But my relatives did nothing to prevent me from feeling overshadowed by my younger brother. On the contrary, whenever Nicky did something even remotely praiseworthy, no matter how routine or irrelevant it seemed to me, they found a way to turn it into a commendable feat. The comparisons became a daily occurrence. At first, they were minor things like, "Why can't you clean your room as neatly as your brother?" Or, "You need to dress better. You have enough decent clothes not to go around looking like a vagabond. Look at your brother, always so handsome." But gradually, as the years passed, they escalated. And they not only criticized me for things I did wrong, but also used the things I did well to reproach me for not doing better. "Don't let it get to your head. I'm not that good, and you're not that bad." That's hard to believe when every moment of the day they make sure to remind me otherwise, as if instead of having 2 children, they only had 1. And the remaining teenager was just a random person they had to deal with out of obligation, never out of personal affection. Do you want me to talk to them? If you could do me that favor, they'll listen to you for sure. They always listened to Nicky, no matter what he said. So it was a surprise to discover that this turned out to be the exception that proved the rule. Nicky, who did try to fulfill the promise he had made to me and convince my parents to treat me better, was completely ignored when he brought up the issue. Not only did our parents change the subject as soon as either of us tried to call their attention to it, but once they got tired of giving us the runaround, they flat out told us that we were imagining things and that they loved us both equally. If they were stricter with me, to the point of giving me more chores at home than I deserved, it was only because they wanted the best for me and knew I could strive for more. They indulged Nicky in everything, giving him gifts and sparing him responsibilities, while burdening me with more work and reproaches that often had no basis. Why can't I sign up for guitar classes? I've gotten excellent grades in all my subjects, as we agreed I would. There isn't enough money. Besides, why would you do extracurricular activities? That's a waste of time. You have things to do at home. But the classes are free. The school provides them, and they even lend the instruments themselves.
Your father already told you no, you don't have time for those nonsense activities.
The curious thing was that there was always time and money to waste for Nicky. As soon as he showed interest in an activity, no matter how impractical it was, my parents went out of their way to make sure he could attend. And Nicky wasn't a bad person. He had shown that on numerous occasions when he tried to help me get a fairer deal. But he wasn't the perfect being. Everyone claimed he was either. My brother was too impulsive and indecisive. The activity that brought him pleasure today could hold 0 interest for him the following week. It was inconvenient for me, but my parents seemed unfazed, blinded as they were by the halo of splendor they saw in Nicky. Needless to say, they didn't demand the perfect scores from him that they expected from me. At first, when I was very young, I tolerated this. But as I grew up and realized that instead of changing, the situation was escalating, my complaints became more constant, to the point that my parents were forced to confront me and punish me more often in an attempt to silence me. Why can't you be as calm and polite as Nicky? All you know how to do is complain.
If you're so unhappy in this family, leave. Anyway, you don't contribute much to the household. You're more of a hindrance.
The problem began with threats to refuse to pay for my university expenses, and ended with my parents kicking me out of the house as soon as I turned 18. It was a terrible time for me. With nowhere to go and not enough money to sustain myself, I had to rely on all my ingenuity to avoid ending up on the streets. I survived thanks to the kindness of some friends who let me stay in their home until I could afford an apartment. I abandoned my educational opportunities in favor of getting a job to survive. And yes, after a few years, I managed to stabilize and start a new life away from parents who rejected me shamelessly. I lost contact with them, although I still occasionally spoke to Nicky, as he was the only one who still cared about me and even sent me some money in those first few months when I struggled to save enough to support myself.
Our parents are in debt. They're trying to hide it from me, so I don't worry, but I know what's going on. I'm not blind.
Let them dig themselves out of the hole on their own. They're old enough to know how to spend their meager fortune.
You know very well that they waste too much, and their carpentry business is about to collapse. Couldn't you lend them a hand now that you're doing well?
Why would I help them after everything they did to me? You helped them, since they treated you so well. Nicky did want to help, but contrary to what our relatives predicted, things weren't going so well for him in life. At 20, he had dropped out of university to take a gap year traveling around Europe, which my parents funded without sparing any expenses. And now that he was back in the country, he had taken on a part-time job at a fast food chain that obviously didn't pay very well. As for me, I had managed to stabilize my life and resume my studies. I got a job at a veterinary clinic, which provided me with a good salary and even allowed me to save some money. I had no interest in getting involved with my parents again, so I wished Nicky luck and completely washed my hands of the matter. It was several months later when I found out that my parents' financial problems had escalated to the point where they were about to have their car and house repossessed. The police had already knocked on their door, and from what I could gather, they were also being investigated for fraud.
It's all a mistake, Caleb. You must help us. We didn't realize the debts had piled up so much, and we needed the money to give you and Nicky a better future.
Only to Nicky, rather. And yet I can see that you've squandered a lot on indulgences for yourselves.
Don't be like that. We did everything we could to give you a good childhood. It's just that you were always a very rebellious child, always demanding more than we could give.
My parents begged for help, but beyond offering some advice, I didn't extend a helping hand. Everything I had built from the age of 18 until that moment was the result of my own efforts, and I wasn't going to let anyone convince me otherwise. However, other people weren't so forgiving. As it turned out, my parents had borrowed a great deal of money from people they knew and refused to pay them back. Some of those people were their customers or suppliers, and they owed tens of thousands of dollars to many of them. Some were so angry that they even spray painted the words "liar" on the side of my parents' house. On top of that, their home was broken into several times, and much of their belongings were stolen. Even their cars were broken into and stolen. For me, though, I never considered seeking revenge as such. However, things for my parents finally crossed the point of no return when they were finally arrested for embezzlement. After the police took them away, a local newspaper contacted me to interview me about them and my childhood. It may not have been my intention to publicly humiliate them, but by telling the truth about how they kicked me out of the house, that's exactly what happened. As for Nicky, well, I made sure to take care of him, and he moved in with me. In the end, I went from being a pariah, rejected by my own parents, to having free access to the family properties again and being seen almost as a hero in the media, while my parents had to serve a long sentence. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more stories.
You should be ashamed at your age and still so clumsy. It seems you still don't know how to tie your shoelaces. You had to be your mother's son. What a misfortune.
Why can't you be like the neighbor's son? You would give us much less trouble if you were more pleasant and cheerful.
That was bad enough, but when my son began to cry because they were being mean to him, my father-in-law crossed the line. He stormed over to my son and slapped him as hard as he could. I always considered myself a fortunate person. I grew up in a loving family with good financial stability, where I never lacked anything. I was able to study what I liked and even travel wherever I wanted. Once I became an adult, I even had the fortune of marrying the person I thought was the love of my life, although things wouldn't end up being as I initially imagined. Gareth, whom I met in college and who ended up becoming my husband, was a wonderful individual. We both studied administration and finances, went to the same parties, and ultimately enjoyed the same hobbies, thus sharing similar interests. On the day of the wedding, I was ecstatic, thinking that another one of my dreams was finally going to come true, joining forever with this individual who had brought so much joy into my life. And yes, for a brief period of time, I was right. Gareth was chivalrous, very attentive to everyday matters, constantly encouraging me to give my best in every situation. His parents also welcomed me into their home with open arms, affirming that from the day I put on the wedding ring, I'd also become one of their children and would be treated as such. It was perfect for a few months until it wasn't anymore.
Girl, have you remembered to sweep the house? Guests are coming this afternoon, and we can't allow the house to be a mess.
Weren't you going to take care of that? I've been preparing lunch all morning. I haven't had time to do anything else yet.
Are you implying that an older person like me should do the work that is your responsibility as a housewife? Gareth would be very disappointed if I told him.
I didn't say that. It's just that I can't do everything. A little help wouldn't hurt me. But my mother-in-law never listened to reason, no matter how much help I asked for or how desperate I appeared. Her excuses were always the same, ever since we had the misfortune of moving into her house. As the wife of her only son, my duty was to cook for everyone, keep the house clean, and take care of the children. My personal aspirations regarding work were irrelevant to her. In fact, since my twins were born, I was forced to take long breaks from the office, not to rest from that employment routine, but because I was overwhelmed with chores to do at home, without any help, as my in-laws tended to assign me more responsibilities than they should have, playing the invalids every time I dared to ask them for the slightest favor. Gareth, who when we were newlyweds and living on our own, shared household tasks with me, now confined himself to a routine where he came and went from his own job, doing nothing productive at home and even ignoring the constant abuses from his parents towards me.
Don't you think you're exaggerating? My parents adore you. They're very happy that you're part of the family. Perhaps if they demand a lot from you, it's because they know you're a smart and capable woman, and they trust that you can accomplish whatever you set your mind to.
No, that's not it. At first, I thought it might be that, but it's not normal for them to ask me for a favor, and if I refuse to do it, they blackmail or insult me, saying I'm a bad wife.
It's true that my parents can be a bit intense, but they don't mean any harm.
The other day I had to go do some last-minute shopping because your father insisted it was urgent. And I asked your mother to watch the pot in the meantime. Not only did your mother not pay attention, but when the food burned and I returned, she blamed me for not being present when I was needed.
Don't worry about it. That's just how they are. They calm down later and apologize.
And yes, it was true that when they were calmer, they apologized, occasionally even giving me small gifts to make up for their previous outbursts. But one didn't have to be very intelligent to notice a pattern. My in-laws were people who, although they came from humble backgrounds, believed themselves to be the elite among all humanity. And anyone who wasn't them or didn't agree with them was destined to be trampled upon. They started with some hurtful words and blackmail here and there with me, but over the years, their behavior towards me became increasingly unsustainable, with daily arguments about how little I was worth and how lucky I was to have married someone like Gareth. Initially, I endured it all for the sake of my children, so they could have a normal childhood. But my in-laws also didn't seem to have consideration for their grandchildren, as at the slightest mistake from them, they didn't miss the opportunity to humiliate them, telling them that any mistake they made was caused by their bad blood. Because, as they saw it, I was the black sheep in that house. And therefore, my children were also tainted by my same evil. We should move to our own apartment.
No. Why? Don't you like it here? The house is big enough for everyone, and it's close to the kids' school.
The situation is untenable. If I can't have some privacy to do things my way without your parents constantly judging me, I prefer divorce. I thought Gareth would eventually support me, but that wasn't the case. He sided with his parents. If he saw any abuse from their side, he preferred to pretend nothing was happening, that it was me who was making a mountain out of a molehill. The last straw came during a family event in the backyard when I caught my in-laws mocking their grandchildren in front of all our guests. The reason? One of my children had fallen while playing, something normal for a 5-year-old, and my in-laws thought it was a good opportunity to remind everyone of how useless he was.
You should be ashamed at your age and still so clumsy. It seems you still don't know how to tie your shoelaces. You had to be your mother's son. What a misfortune.
Why can't you be like the neighbor's son? You would give us much less trouble if you were more pleasant and cheerful.
That was bad enough, but when my son began to cry because they were being mean to him, my father-in-law crossed the line. He stormed over to my son and slapped him as hard as he could. Everyone at the event gasped but didn't do anything. I quickly rushed over to make sure my son was okay and saw that he was just terrified by what just happened.
There, now you actually have something to cry about. Get your children under control and teach them to not embarrass us so much. Such filthy little things they are, and so very disappointing as well.
I had enough. That same day, I ended up leaving with the children to my own apartment, resumed my career as a businesswoman, and founded my new business. It was tough at the beginning, with all the indecision and anxiety caused by so many years of submitting to the dictates of that toxic family. But gradually, I found myself again. I received help from my parents, and after about 3 years, I was finally able to be happy again after so long. My children were safe, in a more appropriate environment for their growth, and the business was making more profits than ever. I enjoyed having financial stability and the freedom to do whatever I wanted with my own money, without needing to explain myself to anyone. And then one day, I received an unexpected visit from Gareth and my father-in-law.
We need help. My wife has been diagnosed with a very serious illness. If we don't gather the money for the operation, she'll most likely die. If you could do us the favor of lending us some money to cover the expenses, we would appreciate it.
And how would you show your appreciation exactly? There's nothing I want from you. If I lend you the money, all I expect is for you to pay me back when your situation stabilizes.
How dare you want to charge back what we asked you for as a favor? What an ingrate. After all we did for you, welcoming you into our home as if you were our own daughter.
More threats and insults followed under Gareth's gaze, who never raised his voice to defend me at any moment. But I didn't give in. It was a pity that my mother-in-law was going through that health problem, but I had no obligation to help her after how they treated me. So instead of succumbing to their mistreatment and giving them what they demanded, I simply advised and recommended them to sell their property to cover the necessary expenses. They were outraged, as the house was the only valuable asset they owned. But when they realized that those words were the only help I was willing to offer, they had to relent.
How dare she make these demands? She has no consideration for a sick person. I always said it. She doesn't care about what happens to us. We should sue her somehow.
A lawsuit had no grounds, and no matter how much they complained, everyone knew they had no choice but to accept my terms. My mother-in-law was able to undergo the surgery, but rather than selling their house, they chose to borrow the money from some people that were involved in organized crime. I knew that it was a bad decision as they would never be able to pay the criminals back, but my ex-husband and ex-in-laws were so short-sighted. My ex-husband, although he also worked, had never had a well-paying enough job to afford the lifestyle his family was leading. I realized this then. It seems that when I lived with them, besides treating me like their servant and making me do all the household chores, they were using the money I earned from my job to indulge themselves. My mother-in-law recovered, yes, but the price was high. Between their wasteful nature and the fact that my ex-husband didn't make enough money to cover their lifestyle, bills, and now the loan. They were forced to sell their properties, but only after having been paid a visit by the loan sharks. Each time they saw them, the criminals would beat up my ex-husband and ex-father-in-law, and promising that they would continue to do so until they finally paid them back for what they had borrowed with a great deal of interest. What was worse for them, though, was having to admit to the entire neighborhood that they didn't have enough money or power to sustain themselves. As for me, I was able to continue my successful career, while my ex-husband and his parents had to start renting in a modest neighborhood, struggling to rebuild that facade of a perfect family they had always worked so hard to show publicly. I continued to progress on my own, in the company of my children and the people who truly appreciated me, thus closing a dark period of my life with the promise that better things would come. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more stories. For